found something interesting, and I was reading last night of the Wall Street Journal an article about this lawsuit that is pending. It'll take place today in Boston in a circuit court, and it's about the fact that the plaintiff is saying that Harvard is basically using unfair racial quotas in their admission process, which is illegal under federal law. It's outside of affirmative action. Now, Harvard denies it. They say in race is one of the many factors they consider for admissions. They've got this admissions data review board that goes into the collective of all potential students. I've always heard and have no idea that, if you're a legacy kid, that gives you a big advantage if your father or grandfather went to Harvard, especially if they've made a contribution to the Harvard endowment. I would imagine that kind of shuffled you to the front of the line. But what they're arguing, what the plaintiffs are arguing, is Harvard should be based on academic standards. I mean, it's a prestigious, elite university. When I think of, elite institutions in America, I think of a handful: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Duke, Vanderbilt. They're not all in the Ivy League. I mean, obviously, the Ivy League probably has the reputation as I don't want to say an athletic conference, but a unit of schools, a family of schools. We would probably hold the Ivy League in the highest regard. But, I mean, it's probably no better than Stanford or Vanderbilt, or Northwestern would be another academically inclined university. But I found some of this interesting, Rev. The plaintiffs are arguing that if admissions were based on academics as they should be, and if racial preference and this collective, see, the collective is kind of it's a hodgepodge of thought and words that allows for Harvard to basically say, we'll take you, but not you. And then they've got all these different elements involved in how they make their determination. But I looked at some of the and SAT scores. I mean, that's a big deal when you apply to Harvard. They want to know, what is your GPA? What is your SAT scores? Well, according to the plaintiff's analysis, Asian American applicants scored an average of 25 points higher than white applicants, 217 points higher than African American applicants, and 153 points higher than Hispanic applicants. Why does that matter? It matters because they're lumping white students in with the ones that are being advantaged. See what I'm saying? It's lumping it's saying the Asian Americans are the ones that are being taken advantage of at the expense of whites, blacks, and Hispanics. So in essence, it's kind of a reverse, and it's a very interesting argument they're trying to make, because most debates in America today are white, Hispanic, and African American, minorities. Some of the minorities are being not allowed to participate at the level they should. And, and then once again, we can have a debate about who needs to go to Harvard. What is Harvard's obligation to America in its totality? Do we need to allow the kids of Harvard graduates to go to Harvard and keep kind of hoarding, the amount of influence that comes from being a Harvard degree? I mean, if you got a degree from Harvard and you apply for a job, that carries a lot of weight. Or Yale would be another. Stanford would be another. I mean, the people that graduate from those schools, obviously, I would argue, have a leg up in seeking gainful employment, Wall Street in particular. I mean, I was reading something the other night about the number of kids who work on Wall Street. Not kids, but, young adults. And the Ivy League. I mean, it's all about Notre Dame and the Ivy League. I mean, it's when you look at the kids who run these divisions of Citibank or J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs. I mean, they all went to Notre Dame, Stanford, or, some of the Ivy League schools. But I found this interesting. If Harvard were to use academics alone, just academics, as their selector in who gets in and who does not, 43% of all students at Harvard would be Asian American. Only 38% would be white. So this is an example, and that's why it's interesting to me. This is an example of a case who doesn't have the white population as the most favored. I mean, this is an argument saying, the the Asian Americans are the elites in this. Now, I mean, there's no denying that. I mean, when you look at test scores and academic data all over the country, I mean, Asian Americans outperform every other demographic, every other ethnicity in America. I mean, once again, they in the SAT scores, 25 points higher than white applicants, 217 points higher than African American, 153 points higher than Hispanics. Now, if you go to legacy issues, then 50% are white. So one of every two applicants, if you start, kicking in the legacy factor, only about 30% are Asian Americans. And then they go into extracurricular and personal. Demographic is another thing. But listen to this. And here's what the lawsuit is based upon. If we're letting kids into one of the leading academic institutions in America because of academics, how foreign would that be? I mean, how unbelievable would that be? I mean, if you've got an academic institution that prides itself on having the brightest minds, right? I mean, you would agree to that.
Sure.
I mean, the majority of people believe that the really smart guys, bingo, the really smart people go to Harvard. Those that the good Lord had blessed, or if they work real hard and diligently, they would go to Harvard. So if we used academics as the reason a kid gets to Harvard or not, once again, 43% of those students would be Asian American. Only 18% are. If we used academics, 0.67 of the students at Harvard would be African American. In fact, 10% are. And if we used, Hispanics, if we used academics alone, 2.42% of the kids would go to Harvard, 10% of Hispanics. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to create, diversity at Harvard. But is Harvard a laboratory of diversity, or is Harvard one of the most prestigious academic institutions in America? And that's what this case is about. I mean, if Harvard is going to say it is our objective to be a diverse and broad-reaching university, then let's stop saying it's all about academics, because it's not. Because if it were all about academics, there'd be a lot fewer African Americans, a lot fewer Hispanics, and a lot more Asian Americans. And that's what this argument is based upon. And I believe the plaintiffs have a solid case. Affirmative action, racial quotas will be brought up a lot. It starts today at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And if I'm not mistaken, some of it will be televised because it's a very interesting case. I read an article by the Cato Institute, and they believe this is the biggest threat to affirmative action that it's ever had to go against, but because of the complication of lumping the whites, the blacks, and the Hispanics. They're basically saying the whites, the blacks, and the Hispanics have got favorable treatment at the expense of the Asian Americans. And it's normally not like that. That's not the pillars of the debate. John Roberts, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, because I think this is where this case ends up, has written, and this is interesting, here his exact quote, "The only way to stop discriminating on race is to stop discriminating on race." So it appears to me that Chief Justice Roberts has made up his mind that racial preferences are improper in any way. Now, Kennedy, and that's why this is important, Kennedy had a different opinion. Kennedy let it be known fairly publicly in some of his comments and lectures that he gave that he always felt Harvard and Yale and Stanford had an obligation to allow for diversity to be almost forced upon them by the government. There should be some government edict that allowed for more African Americans, more Hispanics, more people of color, more minorities to make their way into these institutions, just not more Asian Americans. So this is, and think about this now, and that's why it's so interesting to me, and I know I'm getting to the weeds here. It's normally the whites have preference, and the Hispanics and the African Americans have been, their rights have been infringed upon because the whites have always had the preference. Well, this is an interesting debate. I think the plaintiffs are brilliant in this. It's the whites, the blacks, and the Hispanics have preference. They've all gotten more than their fair shake. The people, the one subset of people who've not gotten a fair shake are the Asian Americans. And I think that's why this is so different. It puts the whites, the African Americans, and the Hispanics all on the same team. You three subsets of people have been advantaged at the expense of this other subset. And I mean, I could go way down the road of who I think's involved in this and where I think the money to plead this case is. The Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. They've got a couple of renowned thought leaders on higher education. They're intimately involved in this. And I think the one thing they've done that is so incredibly, incredibly different is, as I've said, they've lumped, the whites, the African Americans, and the Hispanics kind of into one subset, whereas it's always, the whites against the blacks and the Hispanics. No, now it's like, hey, the only people that have had their rights infringed upon are the Asian Americans. And if Harvard is truly an academic of higher learning, to the nth degree, I mean, if Harvard is what you say Harvard is, that is a place where the brightest minds go to learn and become educated, then there should be more Asian Americans and less what? Less whites, less African Americans, and less Hispanics. We'll see how it plays out. Now, there's a lot of court documentation that there's a finding, in discovery when these cases are held, there's discoveries, and the plaintiffs got their hands on an analysis that Harvard does kind of behind closed doors. The Harvard Foundation paid for an analysis, or the Harvard Endowment Fund paid for an analysis that shows clear as a bell. I mean, I'm an idiot when it comes to reading these sorts of things, but I could even see the correlation between, disallowing disallowing Asian Americans at the expense of whites, blacks, and Hispanics. It'll be very interesting to me. Does it matter? Of course it does. I mean, this is affirmative action. I mean, this will go to places of employment. This will go not to just college acceptance. This will go to promotions of jobs, because we know the effect affirmative action has had in the workplace. I mean, you got to hire so many of this and so many of that and so many of the other to maintain diversity that resembles, the face of America. You can't always hire the best qualified person. Sometimes you got to hire the person who suits, what America says it's fair. And that's why I think this is such a big issue. Harvard can deal with Harvard. I mean, they'll be fine, whether there's more Asian Americans or not. Harvard will be just fine. But I think this ruling, if it ends up at the doorsteps of the Supreme Court, and I think it will, it could have monumental effects and impacts on the workforce and in the workplace. And if affirmative action goes away, then companies who receive public funding, they have no obligation whatsoever to meet any sort of government edict as it relates to how many of this, how many of that, how many of the other do you have to have in influential positions? Because right now they do. I mean, it's real complicated, but some of these publicly held companies that take tax dollars and have deals with the federal government, you've got to have minority contracts, a certain percentage of businesses. I mean, think of this. I mean, a certain percentage of businesses have to be transacted with minority contracts. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying this could revolutionize the way the government conducts business, because right now the state, the county, the federal government all have to do certain amounts of business with minority contractors. And if the Supreme Court rules that, affirmative action and racial quotas are a thing of the past, don't make any sense, then all that goes away. And then the stories. I mean, we've had people that have started businesses in the name of a minority simply to get preferential treatment in bidding with the federal, state, or local government. Those things could go by the wayside. This is a monumental decision that's not specifically about Harvard and Asian Americans. That's where it starts. But when I read an article last night in the Weekly Standard and one of the Wall Street Journal, it is obvious to me that's where this is headed. I mean, there is no doubt that this is where this will end up. Does the federal government have to do X number of dollars in business with a minority contractor simply because they are a minority contractor? Or in some unbelievable way, could the government do a business with the people who they think can do the job the best? I know that's odd in American commerce. Not so odd to me.